everybody. Welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 29th, and we are finishing up our unit on short story and beginning to talk a little bit about our next unit, drama. This means that you have an upcoming writing assignment. If you haven't already submitted in a journal for the short story unit, your journal is due today, Tuesday the 29th at midnight, via PDF, please, to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And if it turns out you need an extension, no worries, just ask me for one. I'll be happy to grant it. The idea behind the journals is that you're devoting about a page or so for one short story, and you're choosing 3 short stories in total. So you should have approximately a 3-page journal with just some thoughts, reflections, and I respond in turn as if we were having a conversation. No real focus on grammar, mechanics, organization, things of that nature. Those are the things that we'll be talking about with the paper, which we will soon be discussing in class as well, since you will eventually have a paper due on short story. And I have some suggested short story topics that you might want to consider in the section above for syllabus and other documents, but you are free to create your own topic. And I was thinking that that particular paper would be perhaps based on something you write about in your journals, not that it necessarily has to be. But we've got several weeks before the paper is due, so more than enough time to submit in a journal and get it back and talk a little bit about the process of writing a paper. In the interim, where we are is talking about the last 2 short stories that I've included in our short story unit. The first, entitled Girl by Jamaica Kincaid in 1978. And you probably noticed when you were reading it is the structure of it is quite odd. It's almost like a poem. And in fact, although we haven't talked about poetry yet, we will eventually talk about poetry in our last unit. Now, Jamaica Kincaid is from Antigua originally, and this particular piece showcases a mother figure who's speaking to a female child, a girl. And basically what we get are a list of rules and expectations for female, specifically in 1970s Antigua. That said, you probably have some connection with some of the other pieces that we've discussed earlier in the semester about how female oftentimes was restricted by her role as wife and mother. That's how we began this semester. This particular piece talks a little bit about how basically female child is taught to be wife and mother. And those lists of rules and expectations in many ways are not that surprising. However, there is that phrase that's repeated over and over again, the slut you are so bent on becoming. And that illustrates the importance of sexual purity for female, particularly in this culture and this time period. Now, you might say that this could become a self-fulfilling prophecy if the mother keeps saying that this is what you're going to be doing. However, that said, there are 2 suggestions in this list of rules that are incredibly surprising, and they're suggestions about how to rebel against authority. In other words, how to spit in the air and not let that spit hit you, but more importantly, how to make a medicine to throw away a child before it becomes a child. And that's particularly interesting in the context with the slut you are so bent on becoming. That the mother is emphasizing that the girl will be judged based on her sexual purity. That said, the mother is also giving the girl an option of what to do if she is no longer sexually pure. How to make a medicine to throw away a child before it becomes a child is basically how to abort a child. So, in some ways, this is a rather subversive text. Particularly when we get to the ending there, and you've probably noticed that most of this is dialogue from the mother. The girl speaks only twice. First, to indicate that she doesn't sing Bena in Sunday school. In other words, that this would be inappropriate music that the mother has convinced her of singing. And the mother never responds to the girl. The mother just continues on with her list until we get to the ending about how the girl asks, but what if the baker won't let me squeeze the bread? And the mother responds to that saying, "You mean to say that after all of this, you'd be the kind of girl that the baker wouldn't let squeeze the bread?" So the symbolism of this is that you're not supposed to be able to squeeze the bread. The idea is that you're violating some sort of social norm or expectation. And that a baker would be watching to make sure that you didn't do that in that bakery. That said, if you are able to gain access and power through perhaps following the rules of society, then you may be able to convince the baker to allow you to squeeze the bread. Or in other words, if the girl follows the rules and the expectations of society, with also the caveat of some of the ways the mother has suggested what to do if she doesn't always follow the rules. Girls aren't supposed to spit in the air, but if this girl decides to do it, this is how she can move out of the way so that the spit doesn't hit her. So, same sort of idea in terms of society if the baker represents society or represents power. That if the girl follows the rules, or at least seems to follow the rules, she can gain access and privilege in her life. She's allowed to squeeze the bread. The idea that bread is oftentimes a slang word for money is also, I think, important in terms of this text, because money is oftentimes associated with power dynamics. You think about when we were talking about Invisible Man and the grandfather indicating that he was a traitor in the spy's or he was a traitor and a spy in the enemy's country, and that he wanted his grandson to overcome him with yeses. In other words, to play the game of seemingly being subservient so that he could have access and power, so that he could try to overthrow the system, or at least gain privilege for himself within the system. Same sort of idea of what we hear the mother suggesting to the girl about squeezing the bread, that if the girl can follow these rules, then there's a great likelihood that she will be given access and power and privilege, perhaps even money. So obviously many of the rules don't allow the girl to have independence and freedom, which gets back to some of the themes that we were talking about in the semester as we began talking about the role of female in the past, oftentimes not having individual autonomy or even identity. And considering the time in which this piece was written in 1978, and considering the culture, and you can get a good number of cultural references, you can see how that also is illustrated, as well as the idea that there are perhaps ways that the girl can circumvent the system. The real reason why I signed this particular piece is because of its use of the semicolon, which allowed me to talk a little bit about breaking grammatical conventions. Because from a thematic perspective, it's something that we've visited before. And I oftentimes think about perhaps I should eliminate this particular text, because this is usually when we start falling behind in the semester. And true to form, that's exactly where we are now. However, I thought it was so interesting that the author is using a piece of punctuation in order to reinforce a theme. A semicolon is a long pause, as opposed to a period, which is a stop. Semicolon acts much like a comma in some respects, but it's a longer pause. And basically, the rule for the semicolon is that you use the semicolon to separate two independent clauses, which is a fancy way of saying you use the semicolon to separate two sentences. But that's what you use with a period as well. Those are the rules for a period. The distinction is that those two sentences that the semicolon happens to be separating are sentences that are very closely related, and you want to show the relationship between the two, as opposed to the period, which is just a stop. Now, obviously, one sentence is connected to the next sentence, or else they wouldn't be in close proximity to one another. But if you're using the semicolon instead of the period, what you're doing is you're illustrating an even closer connection between those two sentences. And the semicolon is supposed to be used sparingly. It's the period that we use frequently, so you want to use the semicolon only for very important events in order to make some sort of a statement in terms of your writing. Obviously, Jamaica Kincaid doesn't follow that rule, and not because she doesn't understand that a semicolon is only supposed to be used sparingly. She understands that a semicolon denies us a stop. In other words, this is a long list of rules from which there isn't even time to stop after one rule after another. In other words, if you've ever heard the old expression that a woman's work is never done, You can perhaps understand why she chose to use a piece of punctuation that denies us a stop or a rest. I also think it's very interesting that she uses a piece of punctuation that deliberately violates grammatical rules, at least in the way that she uses it. Because after all, is not this story about rules and how to follow them, and sometimes how to defy them, how to spit in the air, and how to make a medicine to eliminate a child before it even becomes a child? So that piece is a very short piece, girl. And the last short story I assigned, which was written in 1981, was Popular Mechanics by Raymond Carver. And this is a style of writing that's known as minimalist writing. And certainly we've read authors in the past that have been rather concise, including and including The Story of an Hour, and even Hemingway was known when he talked about his writing, about saying that no unnecessary detail should remain. That was the goal of a good author, was to remove everything so that it's important. So something that seems seemingly unimportant, for instance, a soldier's home, where Krebs is told not to muss his father's paper, is very important, because basically his father doesn't want his life mussed up. He doesn't want his life complicated by having a son who doesn't necessarily follow the rules and expectations of society. In other words, what his father wants is for Krebs to be, quote, normal, unquote. Get a job, get a girl, get married, buy a house, have kids, live happily ever after. Though, of course, we've seen enough pieces, such as A Sorrowful Woman, that perhaps happily ever after isn't exactly realistic. But nevertheless, you can probably see with Raymond Carver that he takes minimalism to a whole different level. And the title itself is rather significant. Initially, this piece was entitled Mine, which makes more sense, perhaps. Popular Mechanics encourages us to do a little bit more thinking. Popular is something that is common and everyday. Mechanics is a description of how things work. So basically, in this story, we're getting a description of a very common experience of how things work. In other words, in this story, we get the breakup of two individuals. It's very telling that we don't get names for these individuals, nor do we get any background information. The idea that they don't have names helps to universalize it, much like in Girl as well. We don't get names for these characters, which helps to universalize it. But more importantly, in terms of Popular Mechanics, is what we get is a rather old and tired tale of what happens when two people break up. And I don't know if you noticed or not, but this author also basically did something rather unique with punctuation and the conventions of punctuation. There are no quotation marks in this story. And we know we're supposed to use quotation marks in order to identify a particular piece of dialogue to a particular piece of person, or to a particular person. The idea that we don't have quotation marks makes it, I believe, seem as if this dialogue isn't necessarily so much associated with a person, because the dialogue is pretty much the same when a couple is breaking up. I'm glad you're leaving. A little bit of profanity here and there as they insult one another. Again, we aren't told why they're breaking up, because honestly, it doesn't matter. The whole point of this story is not about the couple. The point of the story is about the child and the impact the breakup is having on the child. Another way of thinking about this particular story is that Popular Mechanics happens to be the name of a magazine that's still in print, by the way, though it may not be as popular as it was in the 1980s. A magazine that basically gave instructions on how to fix things. And might I suggest that this story is giving us instructions about how to break things. And we get a very dark setting at the very beginning. And even though we get a window, we know that it's a very different kind of window than the window Mrs. Mallard had in Story of an Hour. It doesn't denote anything that's positive or anything that's about expansiveness, but the exact opposite, claustrophobia and darkness. And there's a good amount of foreshadowing in the story too, as short as it is, initially when they pick up the picture of the baby. Because basically at this point what we've got is an object. And you can say, well, you can't rip a picture in half because that would ruin the picture. Keep that in mind when we get to the ending of this particular story. And the shattered flower pot, that this is something that happens to be alive. and it happens to be destroyed. And that also is a little bit of foreshadowing of what's going to be happening as they continue to argue over the baby. At one point, they even reference the baby as it. In other words, they think of the child as an object to be divvied up between them, rather than thinking about this as a living entity. So when they're fighting in the kitchen is usually a place of security, but not when you've got an infant child over a stove. And they're both pulling on this child. And we get the ending. In this manner, the issue was decided. We aren't told specifically what happened. But if you use your imagination, we had discussed this a little bit as well with Rose for Emily with William Faulkner, that iron gray strand of hair and the significance of that. That first of all, Miss Emily had been lying next to Homer's corpse, and secondly, since it was iron gray, it was years after the murder and after the corpse had basically deteriorated. In this instance, in this issue, in this way, the manner, or in this manner, the issue was decided. You have two healthy adults, strong adults, pulling as hard as they can on a child. There really is only one result. In other words, they split that child in two. And as horrifying as that is, we obviously want a different ending. We want an ending where one parent gets the child as opposed to another. But this illustrates what oftentimes happens in divorce. And this would have been in the early 80s, the beginning of the movement for divorce, becoming much more popular, much more common from a societal perspective. Keep in mind that in the story of An Hour, Mrs. Mallard didn't really have that option of divorce. And in the 1970s, perhaps, when we were talking about A Sorrowful Woman, divorce was possible, but not necessarily as common as we see it in the 1980s and 90s, and now where basically at least 50% of marriages end in divorce. In fact, that you probably are unique if you are the child of parents who have not separated or have not divorced. But this is Raymond Carver's commentary on the social differences of marriage and what this was doing to children, where parents were literally tearing their kids in half, hopefully not by pulling them apart, which is what this story says, but by making them live in two different residences at the same time, by asking their children to take one perspective of one parent over the other, to show loyalty to one over the other. That basically emotionally children were being torn, and physically in some ways they were being torn because they had to maintain multiple residences, and not particularly an easy thing to do. But this story really has significance if you understand that it was based on a biblical story, the story of Solomon. And oftentimes great pieces of literature are based on previous pieces of literature or the Bible. And the Bible could be seen as one of the first pieces of literature. In fact, if you think about the King James Bible, which is usually the Bible that's referenced, this was a king that existed during Shakespeare's time, and he hired some of the best talent in the period, including William Shakespeare, to write a rather poetic version of the Bible. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to Shakespeare. But at any rate, if you don't know the biblical story of Solomon, and it is very useful to know your Bible if you are going to be studying literature. Basically, we have a King Solomon, and he's approached by two women who are arguing over a child. Both of the women are maintaining that they are the child's mother. And King Solomon basically is unable to decide who is the birth mother because there's no proof. So he says the fairest thing to do is that we just split the child in two, and each woman can have half of the child. Now the birth mother at that point steps forward and says, let the other woman have the child. And then Solomon says, you must be the birth mother, because only a birth mother would be willing to sacrifice that much and give up her own child to ensure its welfare. That was the lesson in the biblical story of Solomon, that a true parent will sacrifice and even hurt themselves for the benefit of the child. What we get is a modern version of the story of Solomon in Popular Mechanics. Raymond Carver saying, what happens if neither parent is willing to put the welfare of the child above their own well-being? They destroy the child, is what happens. And again, hopefully, we are never in a situation in modern times where a parent would literally split a child into two separate halves. Though, if you watch the news, you can see that horrific things have definitely happened in our society and continue to happen. But from an emotional perspective and from the perspective of one's home, we see how this happens in a very common way. So the title Mine might make a little bit more sense to you in that this is a couple that's arguing over the child the way they would argue over any of their other possessions. This is mine, rather than ours. Or the idea that this child has a life that's separate from the two parents and that they need to find a way to come to some sort of agreement to take care of that child. But mine might be a little bit too obvious of a title. Raymond Carver made the decision, and it was an individual decision, to change it to Popular Mechanics, which makes us do a little bit of thinking here. And these are the last two short stories that we've got in our short story unit, which is not to say that we couldn't read many more short stories, but I thought this was more than enough to give you a little bit of a taste of short story and how to go about analyzing and interpreting. Give you a little bit of choice for your journals, because you don't have to write a journal entry on all of the short stories we've read, merely 3. And you can write approximately a page for each of the short stories, but write as much or as little as you think is valid or necessary. And while we are talking about short story now in terms of writing assignments, journals, and eventually a paper, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the specific criteria for writing a paper next class, I wanted to at least introduce the idea of drama, which is what was scheduled for today. So we'll still be a little bit behind, but I know that we can catch up in the drama section since I have several classes devoted to drama, in part because drama is much longer than short story. Not only does it have one plot, but usually it has subplots, secondary plots that help to reinforce the main plot. But the biggest difference between drama, or sometimes we call it plays or play acting, and short story is that it's meant to be performed. So it's a very different experience. Not only do we have to pay attention to text when we're reading a drama, but then there also is an additional layer of interpretation that's based on the performance. And that's dependent on the actor and the director and perhaps even the producer. And each performance or interpretation is going to be different. So we are focusing on the text of the drama. That said, I also wanted us to view at least one performance of each of the dramas that we'll be reading this semester: Oedipus the King, Midsummer Night's Dream, and A Raisin in the Sun, because ultimately dramas are meant to be performed. So I wanted you to have that experience. But understand that each performance gives a slightly different view of that particular drama itself, that our focus is ultimately on the text. And reading a drama isn't necessarily always that easy. You've got to think about first the playhouse, because where the drama is going to be acted out is going to heavily influence what the actors are able to do or not able to do. And the time period oftentimes influenced the drama as well, because they didn't necessarily have the technological conveniences that we have today, which is something that we'll talk about both with Sophocles and Oedipus the King, and also we'll talk about with Shakespeare when we talk about A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, that said, there is a difference between watching a live version of a drama, which I wish we could do, as opposed to a filmed version of a drama. The film version is the best we're going to be able to do. So they film it as it's actually being performed on a stage. When we talk about Raisin in the Sun, we'll talk about how we're watching a movie version of that particular drama, but the screenplay was written by the dramatist herself, Lorraine Hansberry, and she approved it. But we'll get to that point when we get to Raisin in the Sun. But understand that when you're watching something that's being filmed, that also chooses a whole new experience, because when you're watching something live, you make the decision about where to focus your attention. When something is being filmed, well, then it's the camera person who's making the decision as to where to focus your attention. Obviously, there are techniques that are used to help divert your attention in one area or another, for instance, lighting and dialogue. But we are viewing dramas through the lens of the camera person, rather than watching the drama live, which is logistically very difficult, and with the current challenges that we have with social distancing, impossible, at least for us at this particular point in time. So the text gives you an example of a drama called Trifles. It's unusual in that it's just a one-act drama or one-act play. In other words, it's very short. In fact, it's so short that the dramatist actually turned it also into a short story that is also included in that set of readings. So you could read it as a short story, and we've been spending a good amount of time talking about short stories. Reading it as a drama is a very different sort of experience. You need to think about not only things like subplot, and in this particular instance we don't have a subplot because it's basically just a one-act drama, but you have to think about dialogue and specifically who is speaking. You need to take the time to read the characters' names and visualize what those characters might look like so that you don't get confused as to who is speaking when you are reading the drama. Obviously, when you're watching the drama performed, it's much easier because we've got different actors who are playing different roles, so it's easier to keep them apart. Stage directions, you also have to pay an incredibly close amount of attention to. This is the only information that the dramatist is giving us about what the setting or the environment might be. Again, we take all of this for granted when we're watching a drama because basically the sets are already in creation. So, but every detail is something that is subject to consideration. Should there be flowers on the table? If so, what kind of flowers? What color? How many? All of those decisions have some sort of significance or meaning to them when we're actually watching a drama perform. And when we're reading the stage directions, we can know that basically the dramatist is saying that those things are particularly important in terms of storytelling because this is their vision of what the environment would be like to help reinforce the topic that they happen to be discussing. One of the nice things about Trifles is that you have an example of annotation on page 1091. And the good news is that you can annotate or take notes of a drama in the same way that you would with a short story. So you can look at things like author, time period, title, symbolism, metaphor. You can see they've done that with Trifles. If you're curious, Trifles means things that are not important. If you read the drama Trifles, it basically is the story about law enforcement coming to an abandoned farmhouse to investigate a murder. And while they're investigating the murder, it turns out that they brought their wives with them. And the women are left alone. They're thought to be completely unimportant, and it's the wives who actually solve the mystery through trifles, seemingly unimportant things that are little clues that are left behind. What we find out is that the husband had been abusing the wife for years. Finally, he killed her pet bird, which she loved more than anything else. And in revenge, she killed the husband. And then the women have a decision to make. Should they reveal to their husbands in law enforcement that they've solved the mystery, they have the motive, all of it? Or do they keep quiet because they understand that the wife had been abused? And they ultimately decide to keep quiet. And you can talk a little bit about the moral and ethical decisions associated with this particular play. But if you look at the title, Trifles, seemingly unimportant things, which is how these details would be viewed and how women would be viewed at the time period, you can see that this play is very rich with symbolism. But that's not necessarily a play we're going to be spending a lot of time with, even though it's a very interesting play. And I encourage you, though, to read the play and also to read some of the annotations associated with the play, because that will give you a sense of how you can read Oedipus the King and how you can read A Midsummer Night's Dream and ultimately how you can read A Raisin in the Sun. But as I indicated, we will also be watching performances for all of these, so I'll be including links for that as well. So, in terms of some of the conventions of drama, you've got an act or acts. Each act represents a different episode. And then within acts, you can also have scenes, and that indicates perhaps a new location or a new character being introduced. When we get to Shakespeare, we'll see that he wrote in 5 acts. He always had 5 acts in his play. with multiple scenes within each of the acts. And in fact, it was rather predictable what we could expect in each of the acts. That isn't necessarily always the case with all drama. Again, we saw Trifles was just a one-act play with no scenes. But at least this gives you a little bit of an idea of how drama might be similar to and also a bit different from short story. At this point, I'm looking forward to reading your journals and getting them back to you. I'll start with the journals that were handed in early and then work my way through. And then next class, what we could do is continue to talk about drama. 2 readings that I scheduled for today that we didn't have time for, but we can talk about next class. Talking about drama in popular forms, as well as writing about drama. And I also wanted to introduce the idea about writing about papers, because your first paper is scheduled to be due on Tuesday, the 20th of October, as we move from September to October. And by that point, the journals will be submitted and returned back to you. But we can talk a little bit more about that when we start talking about the conventions for papers. And like every other assignment, you can always hand in a paper early. And if you need additional time, just ask me and I'll be happy to give it to you. So our last attendance question based on the short story unit before we move forward, I'm going to ask you to look up biographical information about either Jamaica Kincaid or Raymond Carver. And then at that particular point, to briefly indicate how that information could be used to understand the author's writing. So this goes back all the way to the beginning of the semester where we were talking about biographical critics, where they argued that in order to truly understand a text, you needed to know about the author's life history. There's a certain truth to that. However, there's also limitations to that, because just because someone has had a life history, that doesn't necessarily mean that that has influenced their particular story in a particular way. I'd like to think that if someone's writing about murder, that doesn't mean that they themselves are a murderer. It is fiction, after all. However, the fact that they choose that particular topic might have something to do with their biography or their history, the fact that that topic has some interest to them. So, learning a little bit more about either Jamaica Kincaid or Raymond Carver and the lives they led, and then seeing if there are any things, or if there's anything or things that you can identify in their life histories that help you understand their writing a little bit more and how that connection could be made. So basically what I'd like you to do is to find out a little bit more about either Jamaica Kincaid or Raymond Carver. Lots of different ways you can do this. I know the temptation probably is just to go on Google and do a search. I'm not necessarily averse to Google, but as you know, it's the wide open net, so you can't necessarily trust it, as well as you could trust something like a database source that you would use through the library. And if you do decide to use the GCC library, there is a database that is devoted just to biography that could be very useful to you. But again, there are lots of different ways you can find out this information. But I'm curious to see what you can dig up about either Jamaica Kincaid or Raymond Carver and how that might help you understand their text a little bit better. So that'll be today's attendance question, and that's the way that we're pretty much summing things up with short story as we move forward to drama and also writing academic papers, which will be next class. So I hope you're well. I'm well, and next class we'll continue talking about drama. Take care. Bye-bye.